we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time watching, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, if you ever wanted to reach out to the podcast, hit us up on our DMs, on our X, on Instagram, at the Bigmark Pod, at the Bigmark Podcast. Let us know if you want to hear any topics for episodes. If you want to come on the episode as a guest, we got our new spot here. We'd love to have you on and entertain you, and yet entertain everybody here at the Bigmark Podcast and the Bigmark family. And that's who we do it for. That's who we do it for. All y'all listening, all y'all that keep coming back again every Wednesday. That's when we're hitting you with a new episode of the Bigmark Podcast. Thank you for being here, because I know there's so many other things you could be doing. There's so many other podcasts, and hopefully you're able to listen to this and multitask as I do. And if you wanted to support the podcast, the best thing you can do is, keep listening. And if you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe, but tell your friends too, right? As soon as you can tell a friend, and they get into it, then they tell a friend. We want to spread the word, and check out our Patreon too. But again, like I said, sometimes you're multitasking and listening to a bunch of stuff, and I do the same thing, listening to audiobooks. And I just finished a book that I've been meaning to read forever. I do have a physical copy of it, but I've never been able to really even crack into it. But again, thanks to the tightwads at Spotify. I call them tightwads because, and I mentioned this before on other podcasts, the audiobooks that are now included, quote unquote, with premium. Hopefully things have changed, but at least since the last time I really dove into things, you're only allowed like 15 hours of listening to audiobooks per month, which seems to be like an arbitrary number. Why would you put a listening limit? Who cares how long you listen to the fucking thing? Like listen to as many books as you want. Like what the fuck's the difference? Who knows? But anyway, I started listening to this book and couldn't get through it, and then had to wait basically for the rest of the month to kind of like recharge. So it's taken me a little while to finish the book, but I finally finished it. It's called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross by John Marco Allegro. It's from 1970. It's a pretty controversial book. If you've never heard about it before, the full title is The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, a study of nature and origins of Christianity within the fertility cults of the ancient Near East. He's basically saying that Jesus Christ and Christianity and everything that surrounds it, and kind of the ideas where it came from, was all from this fertility cult that worshipped a sacred mushroom, and essentially that Jesus Christ is a mushroom. And that's where a lot of the controversy comes down to, because that's kind of like, when you really boil it down, that's kind of what it is. Jesus Christ is a mushroom, which, bear with me here. I hope I didn't lose everyone when I just said that, but there's something about, the book looks at the linguistics of early Christianity and fertility cults, and, relates the development of the language of the, to the development of the myths, religion, and cultic practices, in world cultures, right? So again, it's like, it really reads like, it's a pretty strong linguistic kind of, idea, and really looks at kind of etymology and how words change, but like it looks at where those words come from, what the original meanings of some of those words were, and that a lot of the stories that are out there, the meanings of a lot of those things, have been lost and changed throughout time in all these histories, right? Like I said, Allegro argues through etymology that the roots of Christianity and many other religions lay in fertility cults, that cult practices such as ingesting visionary plans to perceive the mind of God persisted into the early Christian era. And to some unspecified extent into the 13th century, with reoccurrences in the 18th century and mid 20th century, according to Allegro. Again, there's something that, in his interpretations, and John Marco Allegro, studied the Dead Sea Scrolls for 14 years. He was a scholar that one of the few scholars actually that was able to kind of see all of the Dead Sea Scrolls and be able to study them, kind of very closely. And don't get me wrong, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Jesus isn't even mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, talks more about the Jewish kind of Old Testament and more about like early Judeo writings. But that's where Christianity kind of comes from too. But, it's kind of like those things where he noticed kind of things kind of reoccurring over these years where we started to lose the true interpretation of a lot of these words. And again, in Marco Allegro's, John Marco Allegro's words, we started to lose these ideas that they started to become more of a literal interpretation of what was written down rather than, allegory and myth, which they very well might be. But, I think there was this push to prove that Jesus was a real person, to kind of solidify the validity of Christianity. One of the biggest things that John Marco Allegro brings up too, and this is actually on the cover, the standard cover of Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, is the fresco at Plan Coral Chapel. Plan Coral. Please excuse my French. There's a fresco painting in this chapel that is an accurate depiction of the Eucharistic ritual ingestion of Amanita muscaria, and you can look up the painting and a photo of it, but it basically depicts like Adam and Eve around the tree of life kind of thing, kind of classic imagery, tree of life in the middle, Adam and Eve on both sides. And then there's a snake kind of climbing up the tree. But if you look kind of closer at the tree, you actually realize that it's a mushroom, and it actually kind of looks like an Amanita muscaria mushroom. If you don't know what the Amanita muscaria mushroom is, it's the classic. It's like the mushroom emoji. It's red with white speckles. See it around Christmas time a lot. I mentioned that in the Christmas episode. Talked a lot about that, but it's an interesting mushroom. It's an interesting mushroom in a ritualistic sense too. Just because of the feelings that you get. It's not quite as hallucinatory. It's not quite the hallucinogen that some psilocybin mushrooms are, but again, it would have been a little bit more readily available to some kind of like Scandinavian areas. I'm not even sure. This is actually one of the criticisms potentially is like what mushrooms were growing around the Near East at that time. They probably would have been more, who knows? It'd be really interesting to look at it that way. But we know that there was psilocybin mushrooms in Egypt, that they used to keep them in honey, preserve them in honey, I should say. And that is actually what eventually led to alcohol culture, because when we started moving away from more hallucinogens being used in society for whatever reason, whether it's for ritualistic purposes or not, we started moving away from that and moving towards alcohol, because we saw if we left the honey there long enough, it would eventually turn to mead, and you could drink that and not be like fucking tripping balls on sherms, like you were like drinking that mead anyway that had the shrooms in it, so you were like getting drunk and fucking drunk and high at the same time. But I think they eventually took out the shrooms for more than one reason, who knows. But then that's what eventually kind of led to alcohol culture. So, hallucinatory plants and medicine were definitely around at that time of human development. So again, really interesting to have this painting kind of depicting, the tree of life. And I always thought about that too, right? Where it's like Adam and Eve, the story of Eve eating the tree of knowledge, right? And, any experience I've ever had with hallucinogens, there seems to be some type of knowledge kind of hidden in there that you kind of learn, and you, it's always like remembering. I always look at psilocybin, or psilocybin when I do mushrooms specifically, but anytime I do hallucinatory drugs, again, mostly psilocybin. I think this is the point of today's episode. We're kind of looking at that. Like when I've done mushrooms before, it's this reminding. It like reminds you, oh yeah, right, this is what it was like. I forgot. I forgot how this felt. It's always a reminder when you kind of go back to the place. You're not like, oh, of course there's new experiences, don't get me wrong, but there's kind of a familiarity there. So some type of knowledge, I believe, is being passed, or you're joining into the collective unconscious somehow, and kind of tapping into that somehow. But anyway, more on that later. Bottom line is, Allegro argued that Jesus never existed as a historical figure, but was rather a mythological creation of early Christians under the influence of psychoactive mushroom extracts such as psilocybin. And of course, this was, like I said, this is controversial. This was a controversial thing, right? This undermines an entire religion. This undermines people's life work. They go to university for theology. They dedicate their lives to the church. They give money, priests and nuns and fucking everybody, let alone crusades and god-awful people being put away for their beliefs in the name of God, and, I think there's something to be said, because, when John Marco Allegro released his book, he was ridiculed. He had to resign from his university position. He was kind of thrown out, just because it kind of, in the 70s, especially 1970, this went so much against the status quo, and people were so religious at the time. And, I think what pushed a lot of organized religion back in the day, kind of from the golden, the greatest generation, or whatever you want to call them, is that a lot of those people fucking found God, like, in the trenches, like in Korea and in Normandy and in World War II, throughout all these wars. And I think people found God out there because they were scared shitless, and they thought that they were going to fucking die, and they were having like near-death experiences out there. And again, I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing people's beliefs. I think you can believe in anything. I think organized religion, period, and that's not even naming anyone specifically, but organized religion has taken advantage of a lot of people's beliefs. And, Catholicism specifically has had some issues with child abuse that I can just not get behind. But the idea that's there, right? Treat others as you want to be treated. Forgiveness. There's so many different things, so many values that do come from religion and community and all those wonderful, beautiful things. And I totally respect that. But I think organized religion has also kept a lot of people away, because they wanted to be the only game in town. They want to be the only people who are, who is the route to God. It can only be through them. And I think that becomes an issue when, you don't have to go to a church and pay people money, when you can eat a mushroom and you can, the kingdom of heaven is within you, is in the Bible. That's what Jesus says this at one point in one of his, sermons. The kingdom of heaven is within you. And I think when you eat, and when God says, eat my body and you become like me, I think that is one of these kind of ideas that kind of signals to me, like maybe Allegro was onto something here. And I it also harkens back to Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory, that maybe the idea of God and religion in general potentially came from, using these psychedelic plants and communing with God and imbibing the, God's body. And it's a sacred thing, and you take precautions and you take care in that. And I think we've got away from that by our war on drugs and all those different things. But again, I think this does come from the church. And yes, maybe there are a lot of pitfalls, and there's a lot of different ways you can maybe, cut, break apart and find the pitfalls in Allegro's work. But there's something that he was touching on. The book itself, it's a little dry. It was funny listening to the audiobook because it's constantly the narrator is just like spelling out words and prepositive asterisks and shit like that. Like, so it's kind of dumb to actually listen to it in audio form. Unfortunately, again, I have the actual book, but again, he's kind of looking at how words themselves morph and change, and how there's different pronunciations throughout time, but where they kind of go and how they kind of go together. But it reads as a linguistic textbook. I had the pleasure of taking a psychology of language course in university, which basically was a linguistics course. So, some of the ideas I kind of understand how we break up words, how we learn words, how different cultures have different kind of sets of the little building blocks of words, and how that changes as time goes on. But again, it's kind of really interesting. He really talks about, the idea that, early people, and this is some of the stuff that Allegro's work was kind of criticized on, is that he kind of made some like etymological leaps, in the sense that, you can't necessarily like look back on words and their development through the same reference points that we have now. So when you look back on etymology, you have to realize how those sounds and how those meanings were in that time. It's so much more important what those words and sounds and meanings meant in that time rather than what they mean now. So there are some mistakes, potentially you can look at it as a mistake, but some leaps that Allegro makes as far as his kind of reasoning goes. But again, he kind of looks at, just generally speaking, how throughout time, how we kind of started naming things and really understanding how things worked. And, it was kind of a little bit elementary, and it was a little bit like unsophisticated, but, we kind of looked at our bodies, looked at nature, realized we were kind of one with our bodies, but we kind of looked at nature as a reflection of ourselves. And, this is something that's interesting. Who knows? Maybe they had it a little bit, maybe they were onto something back then. But again, they kind of looked at, heaven and God was more like nature. And, the sun came up every day, and that's what gave life and heat and light. And that's what seemed to make the plants grow. And when rain came down, and then when the sun went down and nothing grew and it was dark and cold, that was a time where your caretaker was away. Let's even just look at it from that point, right? The sun was our caretaker. And if anything, you can look at it in that sense too. The sun is our God. And we started worshiping the sun and worshiping and knowing that, its relationship to us. And that when rain came down, they kind of looked at rain kind of like that was like God's semen, right? Because they realized that, who knows how we actually started first having sex. Again, you can say it's fucking Adam and Eve, but I guess just like through evolutionary processes, we just like carried it on from our previous ancestors. But we kind of realized that, the semen kind of comes out of the penis, and that's what goes into the vagina. And then that's, again, this is obviously super elementary. I'm sorry for the crassness of this subject, but, the semen goes in the vagina, and then the baby is born, right? It's kind of like they thought, is the rain like the sea, like God's semen that's going into the ground that makes the plants kind of grow out of the ground, right? And then as the plants are growing out of the ground, they also kind of look at that like an erect penis. Again, it's like really simple. Like basically, Allegro was saying this too, is like that everything in early human beings, when we were naming things, anything that was kind of stick-like, we named more or less after the penis, and anything that was like a socket or like something that was going to, accept that stick we named kind of after a vagina. So, we kind of looked at things like that. It was very, peg and penis, like that kind of idea, right? Where there's something kind of close there, right? And, there's something, valve, vagina, there's just like, there's these different kind of, even just in English where there's like kind of close things, right? But like, there's just something where we kind of look at, if it's a hole, it's a vagina. If it's a stick, it's a penis. And it's fucking super simple. It's weird. It's super weird, but it's kind of, maybe they're onto something. And then, of course, all the parts of the mushroom are kind of named after the penis, with its stem, and then the cap, it's the vulva, the vagina, the socket. And they kind of looked at this as like, oh, this is almost like a perfect representation of nature, right? It is the male and the female all in one. They looked at it like, wow, it has this like almost human quality to it, which is really interesting. And it is, funny enough, mushrooms are closer to, if you're going to look at them with humans and plants and fungi are closer to humans in animalia kingdom than they are to plants. Super weird there. And then the mushroom that is expressed is kind of like the sexual organ of the mycelium that grow underneath, right? So it kind of is like a penis, which is super weird. But then there's something even more, is that, some mushrooms, Amanita muscaria included, and some other psilocybin mushrooms and magic mushrooms, if you will, they have this kind of like dew, almost like this liquid. It's just water that's kind of coming through their pores, but it has some of the mushrooms like qualities in it usually. It kind of drips off the mushroom, and they kind of saw that almost like semen. And Christos, or Christ, actually means anointed, and they actually saw that as anointed with the semen, like the mushroom cap itself. So there's something really interesting there, that's where they started making these connections, right? And like I said, this Eucharistic ritual, eat my body, drink my blood, it's this really interesting, it's like cannibalistic in some ways when you really break it down. But maybe they were talking about eating a mushroom. Maybe they were talking about once a week you went to church, you got together with all your community, and you ate a little. Like, you're not talking about eating 7 grams and going to fucking meet God personally. Like, we're talking about like having a little bit, calming a little bit down, hugging each other, realizing, oh yeah, like I said before, it's like remembering. Once you remember what happened, like that everything's cool, man. The universe is love, it's okay. Don't worry. Be happy, essentially, right? Eat my body, drink my blood, and you will become like me, right? And yes, of course, there's evidence that Jesus Christ was probably actually a historical person. Other main religions have mentioned this, but again, like I said, Marco Allegro is saying this goes back to Dead Sea Scrolls long enough that this fertility cult could have just been another one of the religions that was kind of happening during Islam's early days and Judaism and all that stuff. But again, a lot of pagans were still happening around there, right? So it's not such a huge leap to think. But anyway, obviously Allegro made those etymological leaps. He was harangued in his time. There's a lot of kind of like logical leaps that kind of create this like network and this entanglement. It's like almost, I wouldn't say it's confusing, but there's so many leaps back and forth that you can't help but kind of see where he's going. But it's almost like he's almost just like too far out with certain things. And again, there's so many other things. There's so many other religious aspects of Christianity, and rituals that probably don't come from this. But I don't know. I swear the people who just deny these just haven't actually fucking done mushrooms. Like, honestly, like, there's something when I first did mushrooms and then later heard this theory, there was something where I was like, there is some kind of connection there. There's some kind of weird connection, even like in Christian iconography, you look at a lot of those halos around people's heads, supposed to be kind of the sun and things like that. It was supposed to ease pagans into the transition from paganism into Christianity and say, okay, look, we'll put some sun iconography. Jesus is born on the day of the sun, the day that you're used to worshiping the sun. We want to make this transition easy. But you look at some of that iconography and you see those slits in it. Is that the gills of a mushroom? Right? And again, like I said, when you take this, there's something inherent about mushrooms, psilocybin in particular, again, Amanita muscaria, that's a little bit more like Scandinavian. I think in lower doses it's probably better, but like you take in higher doses, that's what like berserkers were doing. Doesn't quite have the same hallucinatory effects, although if they brewed it into like kind of a wine, which is also maybe what brought it into drinking. Anyway, but psilocybin mushrooms, when you do them, there's something like there can be this overwhelming sense of forgiveness. Mushrooms forgive, and that's where I always landed, was like Jesus forgives, and so does the mushroom. And there's something about that, right? Where there's something that says that, like, hey, if you're actually doing this, if you're actually partaking in this, and a little bit of us, if we can get in touch with God that easy, and if whatever that God is, the collective unconscious or Allah or fucking Jewish God or Tom Cruise, whatever it is, if you can get in touch with them quick by just doing this mushroom, who needs all this, like, the fucking Vatican City and the Pope and all this shit, right? Like, it starts to get crazy. All this money and all this gold and all this like fucking brutal shit that goes on and all the abuse and all the crusades and this fucking nonsense that's happened. We can just say, hey, listen, you don't have to we don't need to go through you anymore, man. We can find it our own way. And there's meditation and there's, we can still go to church and stuff. I'm not saying church doesn't need to exist. It's just the monopoly on thinking that's the only way of finding peace and finding salvation. Who knows, right? Super interesting. Again, you can say, yeah, there's some things that Marco Allegro said wrong, but like he's the only one who's ever really come up with this. And again, you can also look at that as a negative, but you can also say, like, if he was really onto something, don't you think the Catholic Church is going to do whatever they can to keep this down? It's kind of Da Vinci Code-esque, right? But again, the tree of knowledge, man. Fucking snakes in the grass. Snakes are around mushrooms and shit, man. Did Eve eat a shroom, man? Is Jesus the shroom? Right? Because that's the idea, right? That's the idea of this, is that Jesus Christ had to be made to kind of talk about the mushroom and talk about it, because, like, again, if you've ever done mushrooms, it's so hard to even put into reality what actually what is even occurred and how you feel. So again, check the book out. It's a bit of a dry read, which again also leads me to be like, if this guy was really trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, it wouldn't be the most boring read of all time. I'm telling you, people, it was pretty fucking snoozy, but the fucking subject matter is really interesting. Try to distill it. Try to figure it out yourself. Look into things. Listen to this podcast. Talk about it. I want to hear what everyone thinks about it. It's way out there. It's way out there and wild. But again, if it is some way that we can actually start bringing ourselves back to square one, we can bring ourselves back to a place where we can start moving forward together. We can put aside our differences and say, like, yes, hey, we're all speaking the same language, science, other organized religions, Buddha, fucking whatever they're doing in Utah. We can all chat and be like, listen, we don't have to kill each other anymore. We're all on the same page. We're all on the same team. We're all part of this collective unconscious and this universe of love and multi dimensions that we can't even fathom at the moment. But as long as whatever we do and whatever we're doing, we're going down that fucking raging river of life, it's a lot easier when you're just going with the flow. It's a lot easier when you let go of that branch and you're fighting against the current, you're fucking holding on to your ideas on that shore that you think is so fucking sturdy, and it fucking flows away and you're just holding on but for dear life on that branch. If you let go and you float down that path, you know, it's a lot easier. So remember, Jesus saves, and so does the mushrooms. Thank y'all for listening. Hit me up just to chat. Love y'all. Psilocybin, YouTube, Patreon. Love y'all. Peace.